Welcome to Ron Tape. At the start of the film, we are introduced to Matilda Wormwood, a bright and precocious 12-year-old girl with a passion for reading books and a knack for solving complicated algebraic equations without the use of a calculator. Regrettably, Matilda's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, do not value her intellect since they desired a son rather than a daughter. Both of them treat Matilda rudely, ridiculing her hobbies, and scolding her for the most minor of reasons. Although she lacks a formal education, Matilda's intelligence continues to flourish with the aid of books gifted to her by her neighbor and dear friend, Mrs. Phelps, during her spare time. Matilda visits Mrs. Phelps often, sharing stories and engaging in conversations. One day, two teachers from a nearby school visit the Wormwood home to investigate whether the children are receiving adequate education. Despite Matilda's parents lying and asserting that their daughter is receiving homeschooling, the perceptive Miss Honey notices something suspicious and chooses to speak with Matilda face to face. As the parents attend to the other teacher, Honey covertly approaches Matilda and discusses the benefits of attending school. To entice her, she even proposes to instruct Matilda in literature if she commits to going to school. Despite her parents' objection, Matilda ultimately agrees to the offer and retreats to her room. Following the teacher's departure, Mr. Wormwood confronts Matilda for conversing with Miss Honey and deviating from his scheme. As punishment, he enrolls her at the infamous Crunchbull Hall, which is overseen by the fearsome headmistress, Agatha Trunchbull. Upon hearing this, Matilda devises a plan to take revenge on her father for his abusive behavior. As her parents enjoy their TV shows, Matilda discreetly enters their room and pours permanent hair dye into her father's bottle of hair oil. Later on, Mr. Wormwood is startled when he sees his hair color changing after applying the oil. He promptly hurries to Matilda's room but discovers her sound asleep. Unbeknownst to him, Matilda can be seen grinning as her father exits the room and shuts the door. The following morning, Matilda arises early and rushes to school, thrilled to attend class for the first time. Unfortunately, luck is not on her side, as she arrives in front of the school so early that the gate remains closed. Upon arrival, Phelps informs Matilda that she has arrived at school an hour too early and extends an invitation for her to pass the time in her library. Matilda accepts the invitation and trails Phelps to the library. Matilda initiates a story in the library about a renowned escapologist and his significant other, an acrobat. She states that both were authorities in their respective fields and held in high regard. The story captivates Matilda's book-loving acquaintance, Mrs. Phelps, who inquires about the story's source. To her surprise, the young girl proudly reveals that she fabricated the story. She then proceeds with the story, mentioning that the couple marries but is unable to conceive a child, even after several years of being together. In front of a vast crowd at a circus, the pair publicly declares that they will undertake a perilous stunt called the Burning Woman. The act involves the wife, her hair loaded with dynamite, being flung through the air over sharks and jagged objects, with her husband waiting to catch her within a locked cage. Mrs. Phelps is captivated by the story, but Matilda confesses that she does not know the outcome and requires more time to ponder and elaborate. Before Matilda can finish the story, the school gate opens, and she enters with a new girl. Upon passing through the gate, they come across a statue of Mrs. Trunchbull, the cruel headmistress of the school. Other students inform the girls that the school is akin to a penitentiary, with no one able to escape Mrs. Trunchbull's fury. The headmistress is notorious for thrashing and disciplining the students to put them in line before their graduation, turning the school into a realm of terror and anguish. Following a lengthy wait, Matilda eventually reaches her classroom and is astonished to discover that her teacher is none other than Miss Honey, a gentle and compassionate woman who adores working with children, a stark contrast to the infamous Mrs. Trunchbull. Miss Honey is a source of respite for Matilda, and she feels grateful to be in her class. Subsequently, Matilda casts her gaze on the class board and observes that it's overflowing with algebraic equations written by the seniors the prior night. Miss Honey then requests that Matilda clean the board, but rather than using a duster, Matilda begins solving the equations. To Miss Honey's astonishment, Matilda flawlessly solves all the equations, leaving her completely in awe. Miss Honey becomes intrigued by Matilda's abilities, and following the class, she resolves to speak to the headmistress about the young girl's extraordinary intelligence at such a young age. In the subsequent scene, when Miss Honey enters the headmistress's office, we catch our first glimpse of Mrs. Trunchbull, an enormous woman who dons an army uniform even within the school. The room brims with trophies, showcasing her exceptional talent as a hammer thrower. Miss Honey tentatively approaches Mrs. Trunchbull and apprises her about Matilda. As anticipated, Mrs. Trunchbull expresses no interest. She harbors no inclination to give students any preferential treatment and is solely invested in penalizing them and making their lives miserable. Subsequently, when Matilda comes home, she eagerly shares the particulars of her inaugural school day with her parents. However, Matilda's parents, especially Mr. Wormwood, a car salesman, are excessively occupied with his recent sale of illicitly tweaked luxury cars to pay any heed to their daughter's accomplishments. Despite the illegal undertaking, Mrs. Wormwood is content due to the income her husband is earning. Nonetheless, Matilda, who cherishes truthfulness, rebukes her father for deceiving others. In retaliation, her father shreds her book into pieces, leaving Matilda despondent. Plotting vengeance, Matilda sneaks into her parents' room the next morning and applies glue to her father's hat. Unaware of the act, he puts on the hat and leaves for work. The next day, Matilda forms new friendships at school, but her delight is ephemeral. Abruptly, a boy frantically barges into the class, pleading for assistance. His trepidation stems from someone having poured syrup on Mrs. Trunchbull's chair, causing her to suspect him. He adds that the consequences for this crime are dire, and the culprit will be subjected to the chokey, a torture chamber where they will suffer immensely. Instructing the boy to lie down, Matilda remains calm and quickly comes up with a plan by asking everyone to cover him with their coats. As they carry out their actions, he disappears entirely from sight. Afterwards, upon Mrs. Trunchbull's arrival, she is resolute in discovering the offender and requests to be informed of the individual responsible. Responding to Matilda indicates the stack of jackets and asserts that the boy had succumbed to exhaustion around half an hour earlier. Incensed that she is unable to discipline the boy at present, Mrs. Trunchbull elects to vent her frustration on an uninvolved girl adorned with pigtails, whom she perceives to be responsible. Using her hair, she propels her like a ball on a hammer throw, ejecting her from the school grounds. The rest of the pupils observe this sequence of events with dread. Luckily, the girl sustains no injuries and nonchalantly returns to school as though nothing had transpired. Subsequent to classes, Matilda encounters Mrs. Phelps and persists in recounting the tale about the escapologist and his expectant spouse. She discloses that the acrobat engaged a brutal and intimidating promoter, who previously held the title of a hammer-throwing champion, to assist with advertising the performance. Despite this, whilst performing, the escapologist discovers his wife's pregnancy and announces the news to the audience, resulting in the cancellation of the spectacle. At first, the crowd is taken aback, but subsequently comprehend the circumstances and break into a round of applause. Nonetheless, the conceited promoter interrupts the poignant occasion, asserting that the show must go on since she has invested a considerable sum of money in publicity and even menaces to involve law enforcement if the pair refuse to perform. Devoid of any alternatives, the escapologist and acrobat unwillingly ready themselves for the perilous feat. Before concluding the narrative, Matilda once again departs, notifying Phelps that she will resume the tale the ensuing day. The following day, whilst in the school lunchroom, Mrs. Trunchbull accuses an individual of purloining her chocolate cake. Just then, a diminutive yet plump boy emits a resounding belch, attracting Mrs. Trunchbull's attention. Mrs. Trunchbull subsequently commands him to consume an entire colossal chocolate cake, or else risk being dispatched to chokey. Despite the obstacles, the boy consumes the entire cake, buoyed by the support of his companions. Mrs. Trunchbull is taken aback by this turn of events and endeavors to discover a justification to discipline the boy. Nevertheless, she eventually escorts him to the chokey, despite Matilda's best efforts to impede her. Post-school hours, Matilda pays a visit to Mrs. Phelps and imparts the concluding segment of the tale. She notes that the escapologist and the acrobat triumphantly perform their daring feat. However, in the end, his gravid wife tumbles and sustains numerous fractures. Shortly after delivering their daughter, she passes away, leaving the escapologist to single-handedly raise her. Intent on providing his daughter with the finest life possible, the escapologist subsequently employs. Regrettably, the malevolent promoter, who is also the stepsister of his deceased spouse, harasses and compels the young girl to toil. One day, the escapologist learns of this mistreatment and vows to avenge the merciless stepsister. He departs in his automobile at night and never returns. Currently, Matilda finds herself solitary in her chamber when she realizes that she possesses the capability of telekinesis, enabling her to manipulate objects without physical contact. On the subsequent school day, Mrs. Trunchbull proclaims that the physical education classes will transpire in a field encompassing barbed wires, towering fences, and landmines. Additionally, she specifies that the pupils must traverse the entirety of the terrain without pause. The atrocity of the situation appalls Matilda, compelling her to take matters into her own hands. She requests her female comrade to deposit her pet nude into Mrs. Trunchbull's drinking glass, as previously arranged. When the headmistress perceives the amphibian, she becomes incensed and endeavors to discipline all the pupils. However, Matilda confronts her and labels her a tyrant. She also harnesses her telekinetic abilities and drives her away from the field. Upon the conclusion of classes, Matilda exhibits her recently acquired telekinetic powers to Miss Honey, who appears astounded but pledges to maintain secrecy. As they journey homeward in unison, they develop a rapport by discussing their respective hobbies and fascinations. Miss Honey also extends an invitation for Matilda to visit her petite, cabin-esque residence located within the woodland. Matilda inquires about Miss Honey's parents and learns that after her mother's demise and her father's disappearance, she was entrusted to the custody of her malevolent step-aunt. Upon hearing this, Matilda experiences an abrupt epiphany that the tale she had been recounting to Mrs. Phelps regarding the escapologist and the acrobat is, in actuality, a factual account about Miss Honey's progenitors. Following Miss Honey's affirmation and disclosure that her step-aunt is, in fact, the malevolent headmistress, Matilda becomes even more resolute in her quest to avenge Mrs. Trunchbull and restore Miss Honey's confiscated abode. However, upon Matilda's arrival at her domicile, her parents relay a bleak update. Mr. Wormwood notifies Matilda that the malfunctioning automobiles he had retailed have been uncovered, and that the purchasers are currently pursuing them. He subsequently requests her to pack her belongings since the entire family is relocating to Spain. This news proves to be an obstacle to Matilda's scheme, but she persists in her determination to aid Miss Honey and vanquish the malevolent headmistress. The ensuing day, despite feeling disheartened by the announcement of her family's departure to Spain, Matilda resolves to attend school for one final time. Whilst at school, Mrs. Trunchbull gathers all the pupils into a dimly lit chamber for a spelling contest and threatens severe repercussions in the event of any mistakes. She proceeds to unveil a punishment chamber containing a box of razor-sharp thorns. Initially, the competition proceeds without incident, but when the pupils answer all the words provided, Mrs. Trunchbull introduces a fabricated, extensive term. Subsequently, upon a student's failure to answer, she forcibly escorts her to the Chamber of Thorns. Upon witnessing this, the remaining students intentionally furnish incorrect responses, presuming that Mrs. Trunchbull is incapable of disciplining them all simultaneously. However, to their dismay, Mrs. Trunchbull discloses multiple punishment chambers that are at her disposal. Subsequently, Matilda takes it upon herself to intervene and cautions Mrs. Trunchbull to depart from the premises. Upon Mrs. Trunchbull's failure to comply, Matilda employs her recently discovered aptitude, fabricating a colossal humanoid entity from metal chains and obliterating all of the punishment chambers, much to Mrs. Trunchbull's astonishment. Subsequently, Matilda seizes Mrs. Trunchbull's tresses and fashions them into 2 ponytails, utilizing them to fling her through the ceiling. Terrified, Mrs. Trunchbull promptly vacates the school and relinquishes the keys to the premises before absconding the locale. Following her triumph in rescuing her schoolmates from the tyranny of Mrs. Trunchbull, Matilda receives their appreciation but is compelled to bid them adieu as her parents arrive to transport her to Spain. Mr. Wormwood also berates Matilda and insists that they depart imminently to catch their flight. Nevertheless, in the interim, Miss Honey intercedes and implores Mr. Wormwood to entrust Matilda's welfare to her. To their surprise, following some reluctance, he consents. Matilda subsequently bids a proper farewell to her parents and even extricates the affixed hat from her father's head. Subsequently, Matilda and Miss Honey arrive at their novel abode, previously occupied by Miss Honey's forebears, the escapologist and the acrobat. The film concludes on a positive note with the 2 of them embarking on a fresh journey together, leaving their melancholic pasts behind.